Waking up on a straw mattress, you blinked into the quiet darkness, your breath rising in soft white curls that disappeared among the rough-hewn beams overhead. The air smelled of earth and smoke, as if the centuries themselves had soaked into the walls. You were lying on a straw mattress that rustled beneath you with every movement, each hollow stalk pressing lightly against your skin. In that moment of waking, you felt the confusion that comes when time no longer matters. Only the stillness, the sense of having slipped from one life into another. Outside, the first sounds of dawn were stirring. A rooster crowed with a note of triumph that had rung through countless generations before you. The candle on the crude wooden shelf had burned itself into a small puddle of wax, leaving a thin wisp of smoke that traced delicate patterns in the cold air. You were no longer in your own bed, in your own century. You had somehow fallen back through the years to a morning in medieval England, when the rising of the sun meant the beginning of labor, and survival depended on the soil beneath your feet. You sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the coarse woolen blanket across your shoulders. Your hands looked the same, but in this place, they would not hold a phone or a pen. They would milk goats, mend tools, and shape the bread that sustained a small cottage. The floor was packed dirt, scattered with bits of straw and ash. Each object in the room was familiar, yet impossibly distant. A simple wooden chest for storing linens, a rough table with three-legged stools, a narrow window covered with oiled cloth that let in the soft gray light. You reached for a tunic woven from rough flax fibers. It smelled of smoke and human sweat, but also of something simpler, a kind of honest utility. This was a garment meant only to keep the body warm through the damp mornings and cool evenings. When you pulled it over your head, you could almost feel the generations who had worn the same weave, rising each day to face the unending cycle of work and rest. You stepped outside into the pale dawn. The village stretched out in a patchwork of timbered cottages and small gardens enclosed by wattle fences. Smoke drifted lazily from a dozen hearths, rising into the sky like offerings to whatever unseen spirits might be watching. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, fields waited to be plowed, the earth dark and expectant. As you stood in the lane, you felt the old rhythm already pulling at you. The needs of animals and family, the demands of the land, the gentle certainty that no matter how tired you became, there would always be another morning, another rooster crow, another moment to begin again. And in the quiet of that realization, you wondered what it would feel like to spend your days here, to live each sunrise and sunset without the noise of modern life. What would it change in you to wake each morning with nothing but the land, the sky, and the knowledge that your place in this world was both humble and essential? A peasant's daily routine. The morning crept in without ceremony. A pale wash of light revealing the simple shapes of your world. You stood in the doorway, the cold damp of the packed earth seeping into your bare feet. The air smelled of turned soil, last night's ash, and the faint sweetness of hay stacked against the cottage wall. This was the hour when a peasant's life began in earnest, when the comfort of the straw mattress surrendered to the long ritual of survival. You moved first to the small pen behind the house where the goats waited, their warm breath curling in the chill air. Their quiet eyes regarded you without judgment, as if your sudden arrival in this century was no more unusual than the turning of the seasons. You scattered feed in rough wooden troughs and leaned close to draw fresh milk into a clay pitcher, the rhythm of it steady and grounding. There was a peculiar peace in these early tasks, chores performed not for ambition, but simply because they were needed. Inside, your family was beginning to stir. A child's soft voice called across the single room, asking for the barley porridge that would be breakfast and sustenance. You ladled the thick, bland meal into shallow bowls, the steam rising in fragile swirls. The bread was hard from yesterday's baking, but you broke it anyway, sharing the simple fare with a sense that this, too, was a kind of devotion. Here, no one expected abundance, only enough to quiet the hunger and give strength for the hours ahead. The sun lifted itself over the low, thatched rooftops, and its light grew warmer, though it never quite lost the damp edge of early spring. You pulled on your cloak, patched in many places, and stepped out toward the fields. Your boots sank into the soft mud, marking a path that would be traced again and again until the harvest. All around you, other figures moved in the same slow procession. Neighbors you did not know, yet somehow recognized, because their lives mirrored your own. At the field's edge, you paused to look back at the cottage. The small window glimmered in the sun, the curls of smoke rising like a prayer. For a moment, you thought of your own time, of conveniences you could not name here, of distant ambitions that no longer seemed relevant. In this world, your purpose was contained within the fences you could see and the sky above them. You picked up the wooden plow handle, feeling its smooth wear from countless hands. The ox strained forward, the blade breaking the earth into rich, dark furrows. Each step was an act of faith that the soil would yield enough grain to see you through the winter, that your family would endure one more cycle of cold and growth. As you worked, you noticed how easily the hours slipped by, measured only by the slow passage of the sun across the sky. You wondered if this was what it meant to live simply, not without hardship, but without the constant ache for more. And you began to imagine how the rhythm of this labor could shape you, quieting the restless part of your spirit that had always asked, "What comes next?" The rhythm of seasons. The day unfolded in patient layers, each hour giving way to the next without hurry. You moved through your tasks as though guided by a force older than memory itself. In the spring, the field softened and welcomed the plow. The rich, dark soil turned over beneath your hands, releasing a scent that was equal parts life and decay. It was a reminder that all things ended and all things began again. When summer came, the air grew heavy and close. You could feel the warmth pressing against your skin, soaking into your bones until your limbs moved slowly, as if underwater. In the distance, the wheat fields shimmered like a golden sea. Each morning you walked the same path between the furrows, scanning for weeds, testing the ripeness of the grain between your fingers. Your days stretched long beneath the high sun, the hours marked only by the hunger that returned at midday and the slow cooling of the evening air. Autumn was a time of gathering. The crops you had coaxed from the ground all season long were ready to be claimed. You bent low to reap the wheat, the rasp of the sickle against the stalks a steady rhythm in your ears. The grain fell into baskets, each one a quiet triumph. As the last sheaves were brought into the cottage, you felt the relief that came with knowing you would eat through the winter. And still, beneath that relief, there was the understanding that another cycle waited. The soil would rest, then call to you again. Winter pressed close around the village, wrapping every roof and lane in silence. Frost crept across the small window panes, tracing delicate white veins over the glass. Inside, you shared the warmth of the hearth with your family, the fire crackling in a language older than words. By candlelight, you mended tools and garments, the thread glinting in the unsteady glow. When the wind rattled the shutters, you felt a shiver of something like respect for the season's quiet power. In those months of darkness, time became softer, dissolving into days spent in close quarters. You rose before dawn to tend the animals, each breath a plume of steam in the frigid air. You carried water from the well, feeling the chill bite into your palms. And when the work was finished, you sat near the embers, telling stories that belonged to no one and everyone, tales of harvest past, of long-ago kings and distant battles that had never touched your quiet lane. All through the year, the seasons turned around you like a wheel, always the same, always different. The passing of time was measured not in calendars, but in the hush of snowfall, the swelling of buds, the slow gold of ripe wheat. Each moment contained the echo of the last, a memory folded into the present. And you wondered what it might feel like to surrender fully to that turning, to let the cycle of seasons shape your life into something as steady and enduring as the land itself. The life of a young William. In another corner of this medieval world, a different story was beginning. A young boy named William opened his eyes each morning to the same damp chill that filled your own cottage. He was not born to privilege or certainty. His father had died while William was still small, and his mother carried the burden of survival in a world that offered little pity. Their dwelling was no grand hall, but a simple house of timber and packed earth, where each day began with quiet necessity. From his earliest years, William learned the same rhythms you had felt: the call of the rooster before dawn, the aching limbs after a day in the fields. But there was something in him that strained beyond the edges of the village lanes. He watched the mounted knights ride past in their gleaming armor, watched their banners catch the wind as though they were woven from stories themselves. A part of him believed there must be more to life than the soil beneath his feet. When he was 10 years old, a chance arrived as quietly as a breath. A local lord came to the village to collect the rents and survey the harvest. His steward took notice of William. Perhaps it was the boy's quick hands, or the unguarded way his gaze followed every movement. Before winter fell, an offer was made. William would be taken into the lord's household as a squire, a servant and student of the world beyond the fields. He left his home at dawn one frosted morning, carrying little more than a bundle of spare clothes and a memory of his mother's voice. The manor where he arrived seemed like a castle to his young eyes. Stone walls, high windows, a courtyard filled with the clang of practiced swords. There were others like him, boys of uncertain birth, learning the art of serving and obeying. They rose before daylight to muck out stalls, polish armor, and fetch water from the deep well. But William paid close attention to more than chores. He watched the way the knights walked, the measured gravity of their movements. He studied how the steward recorded accounts, how the lord listened and decided. When he was allowed to hold a sword, even just for cleaning, he felt the iron weight of it as a promise. Seasons passed, and the boy grew tall and lean. His hands grew calloused, and his shoulders broadened with the work. Yet in the quiet moments, he still dreamed of something beyond servitude, some life where he could command rather than serve. Each evening, as the candles flickered low in the hall, he traced invisible patterns in the air, imagining a banner with his own crest. And so the young William learned to live between worlds, never quite a peasant anymore, not yet a knight. You might have wondered then, watching him from some hidden vantage, how a boy born to such modest beginnings would ever find the power to change a kingdom. Learning the knight's arts, the manor that took William in was both a school and a proving ground. Here, under the measured eyes of seasoned men, he began to learn what it meant to shape his destiny through discipline. Before the sun rose, he would slip from his straw pallet, the cold flagstones biting at his soles. In the half-light, the other squires stirred and dressed, each movement practiced and silent. There was no place for softness in these early hours. His first tasks were humble. He carried buckets to the kitchen, gathered kindling for the great hearth, and polished the iron studs on the lord's leather harness. Even these chores were lessons, habits that taught him patience, respect for the tools of survival, and the quiet understanding that nothing in this life was truly beneath him. As days turned to seasons, his training deepened. In the yard, the arms master waited with a wooden sword, its pale grain darkened by years of use. William learned to stand with his feet braced, knees bent, the point of the blade aimed low. He practiced until his shoulders ached and the breath scraped in his chest. Again and again, the wooden sword struck, the dull thud echoing against the stone walls like a heartbeat. Riding came next. At first, he only led the horses to the troughs, feeling their warm breath on his palms. Then he learned to brush their coats, to sling the saddles over their broad backs. When at last he was allowed to mount, the ground seemed to fall away beneath him. From that higher vantage, he could see the manor's walls, the fields stretching beyond, and the far road that led to places he could only imagine. In the evenings, William sat near the hearth, listening as the steward recited accounts of past campaigns. He memorized the names of barons and dukes, the subtle alliances that determined who held power and who lost it. He learned that victory was not always won by the strongest arm, but by the cleverest mind. Sometimes, the right word at the right moment weighed more than any sword. Slowly, the Lord began to notice him. A question posed here, a small privilege granted there. William carried himself with a quiet resolve that did not go unnoticed. When the household traveled to neighboring estates, he was chosen to ride at the rear guard, to watch and listen. And so the years passed. The boy who had once carried buckets grew into a young man with the steadiness of a seasoned squire. He had learned how to mend a bridle, how to clean a wound, how to watch for the signs of ambition in another man's eyes. Each lesson etched itself into his bones, preparing him for a life that still waited just beyond the edge of what he could see. And in the quiet of each dawn, as he tightened the straps on his borrowed armor, he must have wondered whether all these small obediences would one day lead him to a place where he would no longer bow to any man. The Battle of Hastings. The year turned, and with it, William's fortunes began to shift. Word spread through the manor and beyond. The old English king had died without an heir clear enough to quiet the ambitions of men. Across the narrow sea, the Duke of Normandy was gathering ships, supplies, and the fierce loyalty of those who believed in his claim. It was in this moment of uncertainty that William the Squire became William the Knight, the quiet youth transformed into a figure destined to carve his name into the stone of history. When the call came, it was not dramatic. A messenger arrived at the manor bearing a sealed parchment. In the hall, the lord broke the wax and read the Duke's command aloud, his voice low and measured. All those bound by oath would ride to join the mustering host. There was no question of refusal. Loyalty was the marrow of a knight's life, and so the household prepared. The Norman camp gathered on the northern coast, a sprawling sea of tents and wagons, smiths and cooks, men-at-arms sharpening blades by torchlight. William stood among them, clad at last in armor that was truly his own. The mail coif rested heavy on his shoulders, the sword at his hip balanced and familiar. Around him, thousands of men made ready, their voices rising in murmured prayers and quiet boasts. At dawn, the fleet set sail, the channel waters cold and restless beneath the hulls. William watched the white cliffs recede behind them, a world he was leaving behind for something larger, something that even then must have felt inevitable. They landed on the English coast, the horses disembarking with uneasy steps onto foreign soil. The invaders moved inland, establishing their camp near the village of Hastings. Each night, fires ringed the encampment, their glow reflected in the polished curve of helmets. When the English army arrived, they took their place on the high ridge, shield met shield in a wall so dense it seemed unbreakable. At first light, the horn sounded and the Normans advanced. William rode with the cavalry, the ground shivering beneath the hooves of hundreds of destriers. The clash came with a force that hollowed the breath from his lungs. Spears thrust through gaps in mail, axes fell with heavy finality. Again and again, the Normans surged forward, only to be hurled back by the English line. Hours passed in a haze of sweat and iron. Then came the moment that would shape everything, the order to feign retreat. The cavalry turned, galloping downslope as if in panic. The English followed, abandoning their formation in pursuit. At a signal, the Normans wheeled back, crashing into the unguarded flanks. The shield wall broke, the discipline unraveled. William pressed his mount forward, the sword in his hand no longer a symbol, but a necessity. By evening, the field lay silent, but for the moans of the wounded. The English king had fallen, an arrow finding his eye in the final chaos. In the failing light, William dismounted and stood among the fallen, feeling a quiet certainty settle into his bones. And he must have wondered then if all the years of toil and patient ambition had brought him to this single day, when the fate of kingdoms turned on the edge of a blade. Becoming William the Conqueror. The morning after the battle was still and gray. A low mist clung to the hills, softening the sharp lines of the field where so many had fallen. It was in that hush, when the clamor of victory had not yet gathered itself into celebration, that William walked among the dead. The bodies were wrapped in rough blankets, their faces hidden from the sky. 100 shields lay discarded, their painted emblems already fading beneath the damp air. Word of the Norman triumph spread as quickly as any wind. Messengers carried the news to the towns and manors, their voices quiet, as though to speak too boldly would wake something best left sleeping. In the weeks that followed, the Duke's army advanced toward London, each mile claimed with a mixture of wary acceptance and smoldering resentment. By December, the last barriers of resistance had melted away, and William stood within Westminster Abbey, a place whose arches seemed to stretch beyond the reach of human striving. On Christmas Day, the ceremony unfolded with a solemn inevitability. Candles flickered along the stone walls. The Latin prayers rose and fell, woven into the air like an invisible tapestry. As the crown was lowered onto William's head, a murmur rose among the gathered lords. Some said it was a cry of homage. Others insisted it was a warning. The Norman guards, alert to any sign of treachery, brandished their weapons. For a moment, tension thickened the air. Then it passed, leaving only the echo of ancient hymns. He was no longer simply William of Normandy, no longer the boy who had once carried buckets across the manor yard. Now, he was king, William the Conqueror, a title that would follow him across the centuries. In the months after the coronation, he set about the careful work of remaking England in his image. Loyal Norman barons received broad swaths of confiscated land. New fortifications rose above old English strongholds, their pale stone walls symbols of a power no longer content to remain across the sea. French became the language of court, of law, of all the dealings that shaped the lives of ordinary people. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility dwindled, their names and lineages slowly receding into memory. In the villages and fields, peasants felt the changes like a shift in the wind. Intangible, but everywhere. Rents were counted differently, tithes were collected with new purpose, and always there were more records, more lists, more evidence that everything now belonged to a single will. Yet in private moments, William must have recalled the boy he once was. The cold mornings in a peasant's cottage. The first time his hands had closed around the hilt of a sword. The countless days when his ambition was a silent ache he dared not speak aloud. And perhaps he wondered if, in becoming a king, he had only traded one form of toil for another, one that required not the turning of soil, but the ceaseless turning of men's loyalties. Norman castle fever. When William settled his rule, the landscape itself began to change. Across the English countryside, new shapes rose from the soft hills and low pastures, mounds of earth crowned by timber towers, encircled by deep ditches and palisades. These Motte and Bailey castles appeared almost overnight, as though the Normans were planting fortresses the way a farmer sows grain. At first, they were practical things. A raised mound, called a motte, was piled high with earth and stones, tamped down until it formed a sturdy base. At its summit stood a wooden keep, watchful and austere. Below, in the bailey, workshops and stables clustered behind stout fences. To the people who had lived for generations in simple cottages, these structures must have seemed alien, almost like the work of another age. Their purpose was clear. A castle was not only a stronghold, it was a statement. It told every passerby that this land now belonged to the Normans, that behind the drawbridge, men loyal to the king waited, armed and ready. Each new construction was a small declaration that the old order had ended, replaced by a power that did not hesitate to remake the world in stone and timber. Over time, the wooden towers were replaced by walls of quarried limestone, pale and resolute against the sky. Great stone keeps rose in square silhouettes, their corners braced by heavy buttresses. From the battlements, sentries looked out across fields and villages, their quiet vigil unbroken by the passing seasons. Inside the walls, life settled into a routine that mirrored the old rhythms but was shaped by new ambitions. In the great halls, lords held court beside roaring hearths. Their voices mingled with the softer sounds of scribes recording deeds and levies, of servants carrying platters heaped with salted meat and coarse bread. Below, in the yards, blacksmiths hammered iron into nails and hinges, while teams of laborers quarried rock from the nearby hills to build yet more walls. When conflict threatened, the castles became islands of refuge. Peasants and livestock crowded within their gates, the drawbridge rising to seal them off from danger. The outer world might burn or splinter, but inside the curtain walls, there was a sense, however fragile, of safety. In the quiet of evening, the stone corridors grew cold, and torchlight cast wavering shadows on the walls. You could almost imagine the first lords walking the ramparts, listening to the wind pass over the battlements, their thoughts as heavy as the stones beneath their feet. And you might have wondered if all this building was only another way to hold back the uncertainty that waited beyond the walls, a hope that by raising towers high into the sky, they could contain the restlessness of human ambition. Medieval castles as small cities. When you stepped through the gates of a Norman castle, You crossed an invisible threshold. Outside, the field stretched in familiar patterns, furrowed rows, small thatched cottages, the winding lanes that connected village to village. Inside the walls, life took on a different shape, ordered by the demands of defense, ambition, and the quiet rituals that bound a community together. A castle was more than a fortress. It was a small city, a self-contained world built to withstand the long uncertainty of siege or the sudden shock of attack. Along the outer wall, sentries paced with slow purpose, their boots striking the stones in a rhythm that never entirely stopped. In the yards, men-at-arms practiced with wooden weapons, the dull thuds rising like distant thunder. The great hall lay at the heart of it all. Its high roof beams were dark with smoke, the long tables scarred by countless meals and negotiations. Here, the Lord received petitioners, dispensed judgment, and celebrated feasts that could last until dawn. The hearth blazed in all seasons, a reminder that power was as much about spectacle as it was about strength. Near the kitchens, the air grew warm and pungent with the smell of broth and ash. Servants moved through the passageways with practiced speed, carrying loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, salted meats that would sustain the household through winter. In storerooms, barrels stood in neat ranks, each marked with the seal of the estate. Grain, ale, wine, provisions that whispered of both survival and abundance. Below ground, the castle cellars and crypts held their own secrets. Narrow stairs descended into cool darkness, where flickering torchlight revealed rows of casks, baskets of dried herbs, and iron racks lined with weapons. Even here, in the hush beneath the walls, you could sense the constant preparation, the knowledge that peace was never guaranteed. In the evenings, the castle softened. Torches glimmered along the battlements, and the voices of minstrels drifted through the air. Laughter echoed from the hall as lords and ladies gathered to hear songs of distant battles and half-remembered legends. For a few hours, the stone walls seemed less like barriers and more like protection against the cold, uncertain world beyond. Yet the castle was never truly at rest. Somewhere in the shadows, a watchman's lantern moved along the parapet. In a small chamber, a steward reviewed accounts by candlelight, tallying rents and supplies. And in the quietest corners, the young pages and squires dreamed of the day they would trade their humble duties for the weight of a sword or the trust of a lord. Sometimes, standing in the courtyard, you might have wondered if all these layers of labor and ceremony were simply a way to remind each soul within the walls that their place, however small, was part of something more enduring than any single lifetime. The power of the church. Beyond the castle walls, another force shaped the medieval world, a presence that reached into every village, every hearth, every unguarded thought. The church stood as both a refuge and a judgment, a place where the spirit might find solace or encounter fear. Its great cathedrals rose over the landscape like stone prayers. You could see them from miles away, their spires pointing skyward as though reminding all who lived below of a higher power that watched, unseen but never absent. When you stepped inside, the world beyond the doors seemed to fall away. The air was cool, almost damp, perfumed by incense that curled in faint gray ribbons toward vaulted ceilings. Sunlight poured through stained glass in jewel colors, casting shifting patterns onto the flagstones. In that shimmering hush, you felt how small a single life could seem. Yet the church offered more than humility. It promised purpose. The promise of salvation was a balm against the hardships that never truly left peasant or noble alike. Within the walls of monasteries, monks rose before dawn to chant the divine office. Their voices blended into a single, unbroken sound, as steady as the beating of a heart. By candlelight, they bent over parchment, copying sacred texts and the writings of long-dead philosophers. Each stroke of the quill was a small act of preservation, holding knowledge safe against the slow forgetting of centuries. But the church was also an earthly power. Bishops and abbots controlled vast estates. They administered justice, collected tithes, and advised kings whose crowns sat uneasily upon their brows. When disputes grew sharp, the line between holy duty and worldly ambition blurred until it was almost impossible to see. Outside the cathedral steps, the poor lined up for alms, bread, a few coins. perhaps a blanket against the winter cold. The priest offered blessings, his hands moving in practiced gestures that seemed to hold both comfort and caution. To refuse the Church's grace was to risk more than hunger. It was to stand apart from the only order that claimed to bind heaven to earth. In the darkest hours of the night, when illness or famine pressed hardest, people clung to their faith as a final tether. They lit candles for saints, whispered prayers into the rafters, and trusted that the unseen would hear. The Church's rituals wrapped around daily life like an invisible garment, warming, constraining, defining. And you might have wondered, standing in the hush of a nave or at the edge of a torchlit procession, whether this power was born entirely of devotion, or whether it also drew its strength from the quiet need every soul carried for meaning in a world that never promised certainty. Monks copying manuscripts in the quiet spaces behind thick monastery walls, another kind of labor unfolded, one without the clash of swords or the weight of armor. It was a slow, deliberate work, carried out in the hush of stone chambers where the only sounds were the scratch of quills and the soft exhalation of candle flames. Here, monks spent their days preserving what the world might otherwise forget. Each morning began in the pre-dawn darkness. The bell called them from their narrow cots, and they rose, robes gathered close against the chill. They filed silently into the chapel, their voices joining in the unbroken chant of the divine office. The steady rhythm of Latin words floated upward, dissolving into the vaulted gloom. After prayer, they moved to the scriptorium. It was a long hall, its narrow windows admitting only thin fingers of light. Rows of desks stood in disciplined ranks, each furnished with inkpots, sharpened quills, and precious sheets of vellum. The air smelled of wax and old parchment, a dry scent that settled into the folds of their habits. Each monk took his place and bent over his work. The process was methodical, lines ruled with a lead point, letters traced in careful succession. Some copied psalms and gospels, their familiar verses repeating like a soft litany. Others labored over texts from distant times, Aristotle, Virgil, commentaries on medicine or astronomy. Their hands moved with unhurried precision, every mark a quiet declaration that knowledge mattered, even in an age when few would ever read it. Illuminators worked nearby, their brushes trembling with bright pigments. They traced delicate vines along the margins, painted saints in robes of lapis and gold. The images were more than decoration. They were a testament to faith, a way of giving life to words that might otherwise remain dry and unseen. Hours passed in the steady hush. Sometimes a monk paused to stretch his aching back or flex numb fingers. But no one spoke without need. Silence was part of the devotion, an offering of attention as much as piety. Each manuscript took months, sometimes years, to complete. And when the final page was laid upon the pile, it became something larger than a book. It was a vessel of memory, a small bulwark against the eroding currents of time. In the evenings, as the last light faded from the high windows, the monks returned to the chapel. They sang again, voices rising in the same measured cadences that had greeted the dawn. When they finally lay down to sleep, their dreams often mingled with the words they had traced. Lines of scripture, glimpses of distant scholars, the slow unfolding of ideas that traveled farther than any army. And perhaps you would have wondered, watching them from some hidden place, whether in this quiet labor there was a deeper victory, a triumph of the spirit that asked nothing but patience and left behind a legacy more lasting than any conquest. The Crusades begin. There came a time when the power of the Church turned its gaze far beyond Europe's fields and villages, reaching east across deserts and mountains. In 1095, a call echoed through the cold halls of Christendom, a call to reclaim Jerusalem, to march under the banner of the cross. It was Pope Urban II who gave voice to that summons, standing before a crowd in Clermont, his words a mixture of warning and promise. He spoke of sacred duty, of the sins that might be washed away by the spilling of blood in holy cause. He promised salvation to any who took up arms, absolution for all transgressions if they died in the struggle. And so the idea took root. that a man could trade his earthly burdens for eternal reward by crossing the sea to fight in a land he had never seen. The First Crusade gathered itself in slow currents. Knights pledged their swords, peasants abandoned their fields, merchants weighed profit against risk. Across Europe, villages watched fathers and sons ride away, their figures shrinking into the distance with banners snapping in the wind. The journey was longer than many imagined. The roads wound through strange territories, across the cold plains of Hungary and the arid stretches of Anatolia. Hunger shadowed every mile. Disease moved silently among the ranks, thinning their numbers before they ever glimpsed Jerusalem's walls. Those who survived arrived to find a city hardened by centuries of conflict. In the summer of 1099, they laid siege to its gates, building siege towers and battering rams from whatever scraps of timber they could claim. The final assault came in a haze of dust and heat. Men climbed ladders under hails of arrows, pressed through breaches with swords raised high. When the walls fell, the violence was immediate and absolute. Chroniclers wrote of streets running red, of bodies piled in doorways. It was a moment when faith and brutality tangled so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. Yet in the aftermath, the Crusaders knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their armor still marked with the grime of battle. They wept and sang hymns, convinced that their suffering and the suffering they had caused were sanctified by purpose. In the years that followed, the newly claimed territories became small kingdoms of their own, fragile outposts surrounded by wary foes. Castles rose on rocky hills, their walls forever bracing for the next assault. The Crusaders settled into uneasy routines, part pilgrim, part conqueror, always aware that any dawn might bring the return of war. Back in Europe, stories of victory and sacrifice spread along the trade roads. They inspired more expeditions, more hopes of absolution or fortune. For generations, the Crusades remained both a warning and a lure, proof that faith could drive men farther than they ever thought possible. And you might have wondered, imagining the flicker of torches along Jerusalem's battlements, whether the promise that began in a single sermon could ever justify the sorrow it left behind. Louis, the reluctant crusader. Among the thousands who took the cross was a young French noble named Louis. He was not born with fire in his heart. He did not dream of conquest or the spoils of war. His childhood had been quiet, hours spent in cold chapels, his breath misting in the air as he whispered prayers into the vaulted shadows. His father, a hardened lord with little patience for softness, had always hoped the boy would grow into a soldier. But Louis had carried a different kind of devotion, one that stirred quietly in the marrow of his bones. When Pope Urban's message arrived, Louis felt both dread and inevitability. It was said that those who joined the crusade would find salvation, that their sins would fall away like old leaves. The promise was simple and absolute. Even so, Louis hesitated. He walked the frost-rimed halls of his family's keep, watching the preparations unfold, shields strapped to pack horses, wagons loaded with grain and oil. He felt a stirring in his chest that was not quite courage and not quite fear. At dawn, he set out with his father's blessing and his young wife's parting tears. The roads south were a slow unraveling of what he had known. Familiar woods gave way to pale plains where the wind never rested. He learned to sleep beneath a borrowed cloak, the frozen earth pressing its shape into his ribs. He watched men die of fever before a single enemy appeared. In Constantinople, he first glimpsed the splendor of the Eastern world. Towers gleamed in the wan, winter sun, and the markets thrummed with languages he did not recognize. For a moment, Louis felt the smallness of all his certainties. Even faith seemed different here, brighter in some places, shadowed in others. When at last the crusading host reached Jerusalem, months had slipped past like a procession of dreams. The siege was longer than any sermon had foretold. Each day brought the smell of blood, the cries that carried over the walls. And when the city fell, Louis did not raise his sword in victory. He found himself in a quiet street, his armor streaked with ash. He knelt alone beside a scorched doorway, whispering a prayer, not of triumph, but of bewilderment. In the years that followed, Louis did not return to France at once. He remained in the kingdom of Jerusalem, serving as a knight in a place where nothing was stable. The desert was unrelenting, the politics as tangled as any thorn bush. He watched friends die in skirmishes and fevers, and he began to wonder if the road to salvation had ever run through these walls at all. When he finally returned home, his hair was touched with gray. The keep he had left behind felt smaller, the voices in the hall too loud. He no longer believed that redemption could be earned by any sword. In the evenings, he sat alone by the hearth, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. And you might have wondered, watching him there in the hush, whether the truest pilgrimage had nothing to do with distant cities, but everything to do with the quiet work of understanding one's own heart. The plague arrives. There were rumors at first, little more than whispers that drifted along the trade roads and settled like cold mist in the villages. They said a strange sickness had come from the east, carried on ships heavy with spice and grain. It struck without warning, leaving behind whole streets emptied of breath. Few believed it, at least in the beginning. Every century had its fevers and chills. Every generation knew the taste of loss. But in the year 1347, the plague arrived in earnest. It came ashore in the port cities, hidden among the sacks of flour and bales of cloth. The rats climbed down the ropes, their dark eyes bright with hunger. The fleas moved among them, unseen as grains of sand. In the lanes behind the warehouses, the first bodies fell, and no prayer could lift them again. Soon, the sickness spread inland, faster than any army. In small cottages and grand manors alike, the symptoms were the same. Fever that burned until the body trembled, swellings that darkened to the color of old bruises. Some called them God's tokens, the marks of judgment. Others turned to older words: pestilence, miasma, the wrath of fate. The dead carts rolled through the villages at dawn. Their wooden wheels creaked over the cobbles, and the men who drove them rang small bells to warn the living away. Behind shuttered windows, families watched in silence, their hands pressed to their mouths. In some places, the church bells tolled so often that their voices grew hoarse. Those who could fled to the countryside, believing the air might be cleaner in the fields. But the plague followed them, unhurried and inevitable. It found them in farmhouses, in shepherds' huts, in the hollow places between villages. The harvest rotted in the fields because there were not enough hands to bring it in. Whole towns sank into quiet ruin. And yet, even in the depths of that darkness, life continued in small, stubborn ways. A mother held her child through the night, though the fever had already taken the warmth from his skin. A priest carried the sacrament to a dying farmer, his own breath ragged behind the cloth he pressed to his face. Neighbors gathered to bury the dead, saying the old prayers with voices that trembled. When at last the worst had passed, nothing was quite the same. Between a third and a half of Europe's people were gone. The survivors looked at the world as if seeing it for the first time, emptier, starker, but also strangely unbound. Labor was scarce now, and those who worked the fields could ask for more than they ever dared. Lords who had once held power with a careless hand found themselves forced to bargain, to yield, to acknowledge that the old order had cracked in ways that would not be mended. And you might have wondered, in the hush that followed the last funeral, whether the plague was only a calamity, or also a strange, terrible clearing of the ground, so that something new could one day take root. Peasant bargaining power. In the quiet years after the plague receded, the world did not return to what it had been. Where once the villages had hummed with the steady voices of many, now there was only the wind moving through fallow fields. In some parishes, the names of the dead outnumbered the living. Doors stood ajar on cottages that would never again be warmed by a hearth. The emptiness was a wound that did not heal quickly. But in that emptiness, something unexpected began to grow. For generations, peasants had been bound to the land, obliged to give their labor and their harvest to the lords who owned everything in sight. They had worked without question, because there had never been enough of them to do otherwise. Now, for the first time in memory, there were too few hands to till the fields, too few shoulders to bear the burdens of the manor. Those who remained discovered a new leverage. If a lord wished to see his grain sown, his herds tended, he could no longer command it with impunity. The survivors could ask for wages, and when wages were refused, they could leave. sometimes traveling miles to find an estate desperate enough to meet their price. It was a slow, quiet revolution, carried out not with banners or proclamations, but in the simple act of walking away. Some lords tried to resist. Laws were passed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to forbid laborers from seeking better terms. But laws could not bring back the dead. They could not fill the empty cottages or coax vanished families to return. In practice, the decrees were as thin as parchment in the rain. Gradually, the old bonds loosened. Villages that had once belonged body and soul to a single manor became places where free men and serfs worked side by side, their obligations no longer as certain as before. Markets expanded as peasants traded surplus grain or wool. Small coins changed hands in ways that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. The nobility watched this change with unease. Their power had always rested on the certainty that the land and the people upon it were theirs to command. Now that certainty frayed. The halls of manor houses grew quieter as stewards reported that rents had not been paid, that labor could not be compelled as it once had been. Some lords turned to debt to maintain appearances. Others, more pragmatic, began to negotiate in earnest. In the evenings, when the fields lay in the hush of twilight, a peasant might pause to look back toward the manor house. It still loomed over the land, its chimneys smoking in the pale light. But it no longer seemed so absolute. A man who had survived the plague knew how quickly any order could unravel. He knew that the worth of his hands had risen in ways no decree could erase. And you might have wondered, standing beside him in that golden hour, whether this was how change always came, not as a clamor, but as a quiet shift that no one could ignore. Medieval town life. Away from the fields and manors, the towns began to swell with new life. Narrow streets wound between timbered houses, their upper stories leaning so close that neighbors could pass a loaf of bread through an open window. In the early hours, the town stirred to the sounds of iron striking iron, of shutters unlatched, of traders calling out in voices hoarse from the chill. Here, a different rhythm governed the days. Craftsmen rose with the dawn to open their shops. The blacksmith stoked the forge, his hammer ringing out in a steady cadence. The baker drew fresh loaves from the clay oven, their crusts split by the heat. At the well, women gathered to draw water and share quiet gossip, their voices rising and falling like a familiar song. The marketplace was the town's restless heart. Stalls crowded together in a patchwork of canvas and plank. On one table, bolts of wool in muted hues lay folded in neat stacks. On another, baskets brimmed with onions, salted fish, and herbs tied in careful bundles. The air smelled of smoke and yeast and the tang of tannery vats. Over everything drifted the sharp note of open drains, a reminder that comfort here was always mingled with hardship. For the craftsman, the workshop was both sanctuary and prison. A carpenter might spend years perfecting the curve of a chair leg or the join of a doorframe. A cooper-shaped barrel staves with an intimacy that bordered on reverence. Apprentices swept the floors and fetched tools, their hands already marked with splinters. To be skilled was to hold a place of quiet respect, though no one called it by so grand a name. In the evenings, when the last shutters were drawn tight, the taverns glowed with candlelight. Men gathered around rough-hewn tables, their faces lined by long days and longer memories. They spoke of prices and taxes, of marriages and feuds, of rumors that drifted in from the high roads. Sometimes a minstrel set his hat by the hearth and played songs that wandered between joy and sorrow. Above it all, the church bell kept its measured count. It called the faithful to Mass, marked the passing of the hours, and told in mourning when death came to claim a household. Its voice was constant, a reminder that even here, where trade and ambition pressed against old boundaries, life remained tethered to cycles older than any one generation. And in that slow dance of labor and rest, of striving and surrender, you might have seen something familiar, a quiet determination that life, no matter how confined by walls or custom, could still offer moments of purpose. You may have wondered, walking those crooked lanes, whether the spirit of the town was not just the work of many hands, but the shared hope that in each day's small tasks lay the seeds of something lasting. The Guild's protection. Within the labyrinth of the medieval town, where ambition and survival wove themselves into every hour, there rose another quiet force, the Guild. It was not a castle, nor a church, but in its own way, it provided shelter. A fellowship of craftsmen, bound not only by trade, but by the certainty that no one could endure alone. For a young apprentice, the Guild was both a promise and a proving ground. Admission did not come quickly. First came years of quiet observation, sweeping shavings from the cooper's floor, stirring dye vats until hands were stained deep indigo, hauling raw wool to the spinner's loft. Only when the master judged your diligence did you earn the right to train in earnest. The Guildhall itself stood apart from the common workshops. Its beams were darkened by the passage of generations, its windows latticed with glass paid for by careful dues. Inside, long benches lined the walls, and the symbols of each craft were carved into the heavy beams: a pair of shears, a hammer and anvil, a set of scales. Here, the masters met to weigh matters of trade and conduct. Prices were agreed upon, so no craftsman undercut another in desperate hunger. Standards were set, so no piece of work, no matter how humble, would shame the reputation of all. Disputes were heard in low voices, settled by men who knew how easily pride could sour into enmity. The guilds protected their own. When illness struck a family, small coins were gathered to buy bread and fuel. If an apprentice died before earning his mastery, a candle was lit in the hall, and prayers were offered that his spirit might find peace. Such gestures did not erase the hardness of life, but they softened it around the edges. For the master craftsman, the guild was a safeguard against the uncertainty of the marketplace. It meant that no lord or merchant could force prices so low that a man's skill became worthless. It meant that, in a world where famine or war might unravel any livelihood, there was at least one place where dignity was protected. On feast days, the members gathered in the hall with their families. The tables were laid with meat pies and ale, the air warm with the smell of cloves and roasting pork. Candles flickered over faces lined by labor but brightened by the rare ease of celebration. Songs rose, old ballads about kings and tradesmen, about fortunes made and lost. In those hours, the guild was something more than a collection of rules. It was proof that labor, when honored and shared, could weave a net strong enough to catch even the heaviest of burdens. And you might have stood in the doorway, watching the candles gutter and flare, and wondered whether that small, unremarkable building held something as precious as any crown, a quiet fellowship that endured not through conquest, but through simple, steadfast care. The monastery at dawn. Beyond the town's clamor and the measured order of the Guildhall, another world endured, a place where the day began before the first light touched the fields. In the monastery, dawn was not greeted with hurried trade or the clang of anvils, but with the soft, steady pulse of prayer. The monks rose in darkness. A single bell tolled, its note carrying through cloisters and cold stone cells. Each man gathered his robe around him, feet silent against the worn flagstones. In the chapel, candles flickered along the altar, their wavering glow casting long shadows onto painted saints. Matins came first, the night office. A chant unfolded in low voices, each syllable a step in a procession that stretched back through centuries. The words were Latin, but their comfort was older than any tongue. When the last note faded, the brothers filed out again, the hush of devotion trailing them like a scent. After prayer, the day's quiet labors began. In the kitchen gardens, frost still clung to the cabbages. A young novice gathered leeks in a wicker basket, his breath rising in pale clouds. Along the covered walkways, another monk swept leaves into neat piles. Even this simplest work was a kind of offering, a testament that care for the world was itself a form of worship. Inside the scriptorium, the candles were trimmed, and the ink prepared. Monks bent over parchment, the scratch of their quills blending with the soft rustle of pages. Some copied Gospels, their letters precise as a heartbeat. Others worked on herbal treatises or histories of far kingdoms, determined that no knowledge should vanish simply because time was indifferent. The infirmary, too, was waking. A brother warmed water for poultices. Shelves lined with jars of lavender, comfrey, and rosemary waited to ease the pains of the villagers who came seeking help no lord could provide. For the sick and the poor, the monastery's door remained open, a place where no coin was demanded. Meals were taken in silence. A reader's voice rose in solemn cadence, recounting saints' lives or lessons from the rule of Saint Benedict. The bread was coarse, the broth thin, but each man ate without complaint, grateful for the constancy of routine. As the sun lifted higher, light filtered through the cloister arches, gilding the damp flagstones. You could almost imagine that the monastery stood outside time itself, untouched by the rivalries and hungers that ruled the world beyond its walls. Yet even here, ambition sometimes flickered. Brothers who hoped to be priors, scribes who longed for the praise of an abbot. Humanity did not vanish behind stone. It merely grew quieter, folded into ritual and habit. And you might have wondered, watching the monks file once more into the chapel, whether their discipline was not simply renunciation, but a fragile hope that the soul could be shaped as patiently as a manuscript, letter by letter, day by day, until it grew into something clear and whole. The 100 Years' War. Beyond the monastery's hush, the wide fields of France and England were stirring toward conflict that would span generations. What began as a quarrel over inheritance became something far larger, a struggle that touched every village and manor, every heart that beat between Dover's cliffs and the vineyards of Gascony. In 1337, the first claims were laid like cold stones. Edward III of England insisted that the crown of France was his by right, tracing his lineage through his mother to old Capetian kings. The French rejected him, and so the war began, not as a single clash, but as a long, unraveling skein of battles, treaties, and uneasy truces. At first, few could imagine it would last 100 years. The knights who rode out in shining mail thought of it as another campaign, another chance to test themselves against fate. But as decades passed, the war became a fixture of life, like the harvest, or the taxes that funded the endless armies. Villages emptied of their young men. Families watched fathers and sons depart beneath the banners of their lords, their armor bright in the morning sun. Few returned unchanged. Some came back maimed, their hands too ruined to hold a plow. Others carried memories too heavy to be set aside, even in the quietest hours. Battles rose and fell with the seasons. At Crécy, English longbows shattered French chivalry in a storm of arrows that darkened the sky. At Poitiers, a French king was captured, his ransom a fortune that drained treasuries and strained alliances. Later still, the English occupied whole provinces, ruling as if the land itself could be inherited like a title. In the towns, trade shrank. Merchants feared to send their wagons down roads where armies might appear without warning. Harvests went uncollected when fields became battlefields. Hunger crept into places that had once known comfort. Yet life continued in small, determined ways. Mothers taught their children to read by candlelight. Blacksmiths forged plowshares as well as swords. In the quiet hours between alarms, peasants mended roofs and planted seed, trusting that some part of the old order would outlast the fighting. Over the decades, the war became something more than a dispute over crowns. It hardened identities on both sides of the Channel. To be English was no longer merely to live on an island, but to define oneself in opposition to France. To be French was to resist a foreign king, to claim a birthright that had been challenged by ambition. And when at last the war's final battles were fought, when treaties were signed and hostages returned, no clear victory remained. The 100 Years' War left behind exhausted kingdoms, fields strewn with unmarked graves, and a memory that would linger long after the last arrow was loosed. And you might have wondered, standing amid the ruins of a burned village, whether any cause, however noble it first appeared, could remain pure across so many years of hunger and sorrow. The rise of Joan of Arc. As the 100 Years' War dragged on, hope seemed a thread worn almost to breaking. In the winter of 1429, France was a kingdom fractured by rival claimants and by the slow erosion of faith. Then, from the quiet fields of Lorraine, a figure emerged who would stir hearts in ways no lord or prince had managed. A peasant girl named Joan. She was born in Domremy, a small village where the church bell marked the passing days, and the rumors of war drifted through the valley like smoke. From childhood, Joan was known for her quiet devotion. She knelt before the parish altar, whispering prayers with a sincerity that set her apart. When she reached her teens, she began to speak of visions, voices that came to her in the hush of the chapel or the stillness of night. Saints and angels, she said, had charged her with a task no woman had ever dared attempt: to drive the English from French soil and see the Dauphin crowned in Reims. Word of her mission spread first as a curiosity, then as something stranger, a spark of hope in a time when hope had nearly flickered out. Skeptics dismissed her as a deluded girl, yet others, weary of the endless defeats, listened more closely. In an age when war was the work of noblemen, Joan's simplicity was its own kind of challenge. She traveled to Chinon, to the court of Charles VII, the uncrowned heir. The courtiers smirked at the peasant girl in her plain dress, but when she stood before the Dauphin, her calm conviction seemed to shift the air itself. Some said her voice carried a clarity that left no room for doubt. Armed with a suit of white armor and a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, she rode to the siege of Orleans. The soldiers who followed her did so first from curiosity, then from a stirring in their own hearts they could not explain. When Joan entered the city, morale shifted as if a hidden weight had been lifted. She moved through the encampments at dawn, speaking softly to the wounded, praying with the weary. In battle, she seemed untouched by fear. Arrows darkened the sky around her, yet she pressed forward, her banner raised high over the breach. By May, Orleans was free. The victory felt less like strategy and more like a collective exhale, a reminder that faith, once awakened, could carry men farther than reason alone. She led Charles to Reims, where he was crowned at last. In the cathedral's dim light, Joan stood near the altar, her armor dulled by the journey, but her purpose undiminished. For a moment, it seemed the old divisions might mend, that the kingdom might remember itself whole again. But the tide of war is never gentle. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, Joan was tried for heresy. She faced her accusers, not with defiance, but with the same serene certainty she had carried from Domremy. In 1431, she was condemned and burned in the marketplace at Rouen. Her ashes drifted over the cobblestones, but her story refused to settle. It rose again in songs and chronicles, a testament that even in the darkest seasons, the courage of one spirit can alter the shape of history. And you might have wondered, hearing her name carried on the wind, whether faith itself is the quiet force that can never be conquered. The tide of change. As the 15th century drew to its close, the world that had once seemed so fixed began to stir with a new restlessness. Castles still crowned the hills, monasteries still held their quiet vigils, but something subtle had shifted in the minds of men. It was as if, after centuries of toil and ritual, a collective breath was held in anticipation of what might come next. Trade grew along the old roads, no longer content to serve only local needs. Merchants traveled farther than their fathers ever dared, carrying bolts of Italian silk, barrels of Flemish wool, and spices whose names still tasted foreign on the tongue. Coins passed from hand to hand in markets that pulsed with voices in many dialects. In the towns, a new class of people began to rise: artisans, traders, and guildsmen whose prosperity came not from land, but from skill and enterprise. The printed word arrived, quiet as dawn at first. In workshops dim with ink and the smell of hot lead, the first presses began their work. Pages multiplied in ways no monk's hand could rival. Stories, sermons, treatises, once the privilege of the few, now flowed outward to touch lives far beyond cathedral schools and noble halls. A farm boy might read of Rome's old legions. A merchant's daughter might trace her finger over the lines of Scripture in her own tongue. Even the old pillars of faith felt the tremors. Some priests embraced the change, seeing in it a way to reach souls more deeply. Others turned wary, fearing that too many voices might fracture the unity that had bound Europe for so long. In the countryside, peasants still rose before dawn to tend their fields, but their children began to dream of other lives. An apprentice in a cloth hall might imagine crossing the sea to Flanders. A miller's son might wonder what it would feel like to study law or medicine in a city whose towers gleamed in the distance. The noble families, too, found themselves transformed. Those who adapted to commerce prospered. Those who clung only to the old claims of birth began to feel the ground slip beneath them. Wealth no longer came solely from the rents of tenants. It was minted in the counting houses and measured in the ledgers that recorded not just land, but ambition. And so the medieval world began its long, unhurried departure. The chronicles would later call it decline, but for those who lived through it, it was more a quiet unfolding, 1,000 small changes gathering into a tide no king or pope could stem. In the evenings, as the lamps were lit and shutters closed, families sat together and spoke of the days to come. No one could name exactly what waited beyond the familiar patterns of sowing and reaping, prayer and penance. But there was a sense, gentle and unsettling both, that something new was rising. And you might have wondered, in that hush before the dawn of the Renaissance, whether every age ends this way. With hearts poised between memory and possibility, listening for the first tremor of a world yet to be. The rise of Temujin on the vast, cold steppe of Central Asia, where the grass bent beneath the restless wind and the sky seemed to stretch forever. A boy was born beneath a felt tent. They named him Temujin. In the quiet of the camp, the elders spoke of omens, of spirits moving through the night. But to his family, he was simply a child of the Mongol plain, another small life carried along the endless rhythms of migration. It was the year 1162, though no calendars marked the date with certainty. The clans drifted between pastures, driving herds of horses and sheep, and each season brought new hardships. As Temujin grew, he learned that life offered no safety. When he was still a boy, his father, Yasugai, was poisoned by rivals during a feast. There had been laughter, cups of kumis lifted in a circle, and then, not long after, a sudden stillness that spread across the family like a winter frost. After Yasugai's death, the clan abandoned Temujin's mother, Hoelun, and her children. In the hierarchy of nomad life, a widow without strong kin was left behind, as if she had ceased to matter. The family's horses were driven away, the yurts dismantled, and the other families rode on. Hoelun gathered what little remained and turned her face to the wind. There was no choice but to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. Temujin hunted for small game with a bow nearly as tall as he was. He set traps for marmots, dug roots in the thawing earth, and learned to read the signs of the grass. He watched his mother work, never faltering, never allowing the children to sense despair in her voice. Perhaps it was then that he first understood that strength did not always look like the swing of a sword. Sometimes it looked like a woman who refused to die in the snow. Years passed, and Temujin grew lean and strong. He began to understand the hidden rules that bound the steppe together. Alliances and betrayals, oaths sworn and broken, the delicate balance between submission and pride. Though he was often alone, he listened carefully when traders passed through their encampments, bringing rumors of distant tribes and petty khans who claimed the title of master. In the quiet hours before dawn, he wondered whether the spirits of his ancestors watched from the cold stars overhead. Perhaps they whispered that he was meant for something larger than the struggle for one more day. But there was no prophecy carved in stone, no destiny revealed in dreams. There was only the will to endure, and the knowledge that no one would save him if he failed. When he was a young man, Temujin returned to reclaim the bride promised to him in childhood, a girl named Borta from the Anguirot tribe. The marriage bound him to new allies and offered a fragile foothold in the shifting politics of the steppes. But soon, an old enemy, the Merkit tribe, raided their camp and carried Berta away into captivity. In the endless dusk that followed, Temujin gathered what strength he could, reaching out to his blood brother Jamuka and the powerful Togrul, Khan of the Kirates. Together, their forces fell upon the Merkit camp. Fires rose against the dark, arrows hissed through the air, and in the chaos, Berta was rescued. It was a moment that shaped Temujin's resolve. No one would ever steal his family again without consequences. He began to see that the tribes were not as immovable as they seemed. A leader with courage, skill, and an unbending will could draw men to his side. Temujin's following grew slowly. Warriors gathered to him not only from loyalty, but from exhaustion with the petty quarrels that kept the Mongols divided. He offered a different vision, a brotherhood bound not just by birth, but by shared purpose. At night, in the circle of their campfires, men spoke of his fairness, of the way he took counsel from even the lowliest herdsmen. They called him Khan, though the title had not yet been formally bestowed. Still, rivals circled him like wolves in the dark. The old tribal order resented any man who claimed new authority. Jamuka, once his friend, turned against him. For a time, the two were locked in a cold rivalry, each seeking to prove that only he deserved to lead. When they finally clashed, Temujin emerged victorious. It was said he treated the defeated nobles with a cold efficiency. Those who refused to follow were executed. Their lines ended beneath the indifferent sky. But it was not cruelty for its own sake. In Temujin's mind, the endless cycle of raids and reprisals had weakened the Mongol people. If they were to survive, the tribes had to be brought together, not as a loose confederation, but as a single force that could stand against the world. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the great Kurultai gathered. Chiefs from every tribe assembled in their finest garments, banners fluttering in the wind. It was a moment that felt older than memory, as if every ancestor watched from the hills. Temujin stepped forward to accept the title that would echo across continents. They called him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The name was not merely a title, but an intent, to forge something that had never existed, a Mongol nation strong enough to shape the fate of empires. In the seasons that followed, he began the work of unification in earnest. Laws were proclaimed, justice was codified, and merit became the measure of rank. No longer would noble birth alone decide a man's place. In this new order, loyalty and skill were the coins of power. As the tribes gathered beneath his banner, there were moments when even his closest companions felt the quiet certainty in him. They spoke in hushed voices of a destiny unfolding, of a man whose spirit seemed carved from the iron hills themselves. Yet for all the triumphs to come, the roots of Genghis Khan's empire remained simple. A boy who survived abandonment, a family that refused to perish, and a leader who believed that unity was worth any price. And as the sun set over the endless grasslands, the whispers of that first gathering carried on the wind, a promise that the world beyond the steppe would soon feel the tread of Mongol horses. But what would happen when the tribes at last turned their gaze outward, and the rest of the world began to understand that the steppe was no longer divided? The conquest machine. When the tribes finally stood as one, the steppes seemed to exhale, as though some ancient longing had found its voice. In the spring of 1207, Genghis Khan began to move beyond the familiar pastures, sending detachments to bring the forest peoples of Siberia into his fold. They were the first of many to face the quiet certainty that resistance would be met with thorough and measured force. Those early campaigns were as much a rehearsal as a conquest. The Mongol commanders practiced the tactics that would become their signature. Feigned retreats to lure enemies into the open, sudden advances that struck like lightning, and the encirclement of entire armies before the foe even understood what was happening. The horsemen rode with a discipline that astonished those who witnessed it. Each warrior kept at least 3 mounts, switching frequently so that the horses never tired. They carried small rations of dried milk, curd, and meat, which allowed them to travel for days with no need to forage. The Mongols became a living storm, one that rolled across the land without warning and left no clear path in its wake. In 1211, Genghis Khan led his forces south across the Gobi Desert toward the Jin dynasty, the rulers of northern China. The Jin believed their massive walls would protect them. For centuries, those fortifications had held back raiders. But the Mongols were not merely raiders. They were a force animated by a new idea, that the world beyond the steppe belonged to them if they were strong enough to take it. The Mongol cavalry swept over the frontier fortresses, their arrows falling in unbroken waves. The defenders, unaccustomed to such relentless assaults, often surrendered in confusion. Those who resisted were treated with a severity that quickly became legend. Towns that refused to yield were sometimes reduced to ash, their inhabitants slaughtered as a warning to others. Yet the Mongols were also pragmatic. Skilled artisans were spared and sent back to the steppe to contribute their knowledge. Genghis understood that an empire was not sustained by fear alone. It needed roads, scribes, and clever hands to build what the horsemen could not. As the campaigns continued, the Mongol war machine evolved. Genghis established a system of intelligence gathering that reached far beyond his lines. Merchants and scouts brought reports of rival armies, of cities poorly defended, of routes through mountain passes, where a sudden descent might catch an enemy unprepared. Each piece of information was woven into his plans with patient precision. In 1215, the Mongols laid siege to Zhengdu, the city that would later become Beijing. The Jin had withdrawn behind their massive walls, trusting in their fortifications. For months, the Mongols cut off supplies, intercepting every caravan that attempted to bring food or reinforcements. The city slowly began to starve. It was in this period that the Mongols perfected the art of psychological warfare. They sent messages promising leniency in return for submission, and rumors spread among the defenders that surrender might spare their lives. Some gates were opened not by force, but by desperation. When Zhengdu finally fell, the Mongols dismantled its defenses, stone by stone, ensuring it could never again defy them. From the smoldering ruins, Genghis sent his generals westward. While he remained in the east to consolidate power, his lieutenants Subutai and Jebei led expeditions that tested the strength of every kingdom in their path. Their campaigns were quiet preludes to the great invasions that would come. They struck the Western Xia, the Khwarezmian Empire, and distant Russian principalities. Each advance brought new tactics, new lessons. The Mongol armies learned to cross rivers under fire, to breach fortress walls with Chinese siege engines, to survive the winters of unfamiliar lands. They studied their adversaries with the same patience they showed when hunting game on the steppe. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan summoned scholars and administrators from every conquered territory. They helped him develop a written law code, the Yasa, that blended Mongol custom with rules of conduct intended to bind the growing empire together. The Yasa was recited aloud to the assembled commanders, a reminder that conquest without order would collapse under its own weight. In the long marches between campaigns, the warriors led their strings of horses across empty plains. They sang old songs, mended their gear by firelight, and waited for the next summons. Some must have wondered whether there would ever be an end to the conquests, or whether the horizon would simply continue to recede as they pressed onward. In 1219, Genghis turned his attention to Khwarezm, a wealthy empire sprawling across Central Asia. The conflict began over a single insult: merchants murdered in a border town, their goods seized by a governor too arrogant to understand what provocation he had offered. Genghis demanded reparations. The Shah refused, and so the full force of the Mongol war machine uncoiled. Entire cities vanished beneath its advance. Witnesses spoke of towers built from skulls, of the air filled with the cries of the dying. Yet behind the horror lay the same cold calculation. The faster the resistance was broken, the sooner order could be restored. Even as Khwarezm fell, the Mongols pressed farther. Their cavalry reached the Caspian Sea, swept into the Caucasus, and rode across the Russian steppe. The old boundaries between east and west began to blur beneath the hoofbeats. Through every campaign, Genghis Khan remained at the center, a quiet figure in a simple felt tent, consulting his maps and weighing the reports of his generals. Those who met him were struck by the contrast between his reputation and his manner. He listened intently, asked questions in a calm voice, and rarely showed anger. To his followers, this composure was a sign that the conquests were not the work of impulse, but of purpose. To conquer was to fulfill a vision that had begun long before, when a boy hunted marmots to keep his family alive. And in the hush before dawn, as the horses shifted in their sleep, some must have sensed that this vision would not stop until every known kingdom had been measured and found wanting. But what would become of a world that suddenly discovered it had no defenses left against such a patient and tireless force? The Silk Road rebooted. When the thunder of Mongol hooves began to fade behind them, many merchants felt an uneasy relief, as if the departure of the conquerors might signal a return to familiar patterns of trade. But in truth, the Mongol advance had only begun to reshape the great routes that stitched Eurasia together. For centuries, the Silk Road had connected China's wealth to the hungry markets of the Mediterranean. Caravans of camels and mules carried bolts of shimmering silk, jars of bright saffron, heavy ingots of silver, and bundles of fine paper. The journey was always perilous. Bandits waited among rocky passes, tolls multiplied at each border, and the rivalry between distant khanates meant that a single political quarrel could close 1,000 miles of road. Then the Mongol Empire swept aside those barriers. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the trade routes were drawn into one vast, if uneasy, domain. For the first time in memory, a merchant could ride from the walls of Beijing to the Black Sea under the same authority, bearing a passport stamped with the seal of the Khan. The passport, a simple tablet of wood, was treated with an almost magical respect. It declared that the bearer traveled in the name of the great Khan and was to be given fresh horses, protection, and shelter in every station along the way. To defy this order was to invite a swift and merciless reprisal. The Mongols did not merely tolerate commerce, they relied on it. While their armies could seize tribute, their new empire needed wealth that could not be looted. Taxes on caravan traffic, fees from wealthy merchants, revenue from the markets that sprang up along the old roads. In the dusty towns that dotted Central Asia, new customs posts appeared. Officials recorded each bale of silk, each crate of spices. Guards patrolled the caravan routes, hunting bandits with the same determination they had once shown for enemy armies. Along the way, fresh outposts were built, way stations where travelers could rest, water their animals, and trade gossip about the ever-shifting balance of power. And so the Silk Road entered a strange, golden season. From Samarkand to Tabriz, bazaars overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. Venetian glass was exchanged for Persian rugs. Chinese porcelain traded for Arabian incense. Even European merchants, who once dared only the edges of this world, began to venture deeper, lured by the prospect of riches. At night, the caravanserais filled with the smoke of cooking fires. Men unrolled their blankets and spoke in soft voices, comparing the dangers of the road with the profits they might carry home. Some must have felt that the Mongols were both conquerors and protectors, a presence at once oppressive and strangely necessary. In the court of the Khan, foreign envoys appeared bearing tribute and curiosity. They brought gifts of embroidered cloth, fine wines, and intricate clocks, hoping to secure trade privileges and a measure of safety for their countrymen. The Mongol rulers, in turn, welcomed the flow of knowledge and novelty. They gathered translators who could render Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Latin into Mongolian, allowing them to read foreign texts and issue decrees that spanned continents. Beneath the surface, ideas and beliefs drifted across borders as easily as silk. Islamic astronomy mingled with Chinese medicine. Buddhist monks journeyed west, carrying scrolls and relics. Christian missionaries traveled eastward, hoping to find converts among the steppes warriors. For the Mongols themselves, the Silk Road was both an artery and a mirror. They saw in its endless caravans a reflection of their own ambition, an empire that had not only conquered, but connected. Each wagon that trundled across the plains carried a fragment of that vision, the sense that the world was no longer a patchwork of isolated realms, but something closer to a single, restless organism. Yet prosperity came with new vulnerabilities. As the roads grew busier, so too did the shadows along their edges. Small bands of rebels and outlaws emerged, striking caravans when they could and vanishing again. The Mongol garrisons hunted them relentlessly, but no system could be flawless over such distances. Meanwhile, in the crowded ports of the Black Sea, cargo ships gathered to receive goods bound for the cities of Europe. Among the sacks of grain and bundles of cloth, a quieter passenger waited, one that no customs inspector could detect. Fleas clung to the fur of black rats, carrying within them the seeds of devastation. In the year 1347, merchant vessels sailed west with their holds full and their crews unsuspecting. When they docked in Messina and Constantinople, when they unloaded their cargoes and settled their accounts, they also released a contagion that would soon unmake the fragile order. The Black Death rode the same highways that had brought wealth and knowledge. In a matter of years, it would darken doorways from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, carrying away peasants and princes alike. Some chroniclers would look back and say the plague had come as punishment, that the Mongol conquests and the arrogance of new trade had summoned divine wrath. Others would see it as chance, another reminder that all empires, no matter how vast, are vulnerable to the smallest enemies. Yet before the plague, there had been a moment when the Silk Road gleamed with possibility. Travelers carried letters sealed with wax, coins stamped with unfamiliar symbols, and stories of cities beyond imagining. A new sense of the world's breadth began to seep into the thoughts of distant peoples, softening old prejudices and planting questions that would outlive the Mongol Empire itself. In the hush before dawn, a merchant on the road to Bukhara might have looked to the horizon and felt, just for an instant, that he stood at the center of something larger than any kingdom, that the wind which stirred the banners of Genghis Khan still carried the echo of his ambition, a quiet insistence that borders were illusions and that everything could be connected if only one dared to ride far enough. But who could have guessed that the same roads that brought prosperity would soon bring a darkness no army could repel? The fall of Baghdad. The morning the Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, a hush settled over Baghdad like an omen. For centuries, the city had been the jewel of the Islamic world, a place where scholars debated in marble courtyards and poets composed verses beneath the shade of orange trees. Here, the Abbasid caliphs had reigned in splendor, presiding over an age of discovery that illuminated medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. But by the year 1258, the golden era had begun to dull. Rival dynasties quarreled on distant frontiers, tax collectors grew ever more grasping, and the caliph's authority no longer inspired the awe it once had. Even so, few believed the Mongols could threaten Baghdad itself. The city's walls were tall, its defenders numerous, and its name alone seemed to carry a shield of divine favor. Then came Hulagu Khan. A grandson of Genghis, he had been entrusted with a mission that felt almost ceremonial at first, an expedition to subdue the last independent Muslim powers in Persia and Mesopotamia. But as his armies advanced, it became clear that this was no passing raid. City after city fell, often without a struggle. Those that resisted were given no second chance. By the winter of 1257, Hulagu's forces stood before Baghdad, encamped in a wide crescent that stretched across the Tigris River. Sappers began to dig trenches and build palisades. Giant catapults, constructed from timber hauled across hundreds of miles, were assembled piece by piece. They loomed over the plain, their long arms poised to hurl stones against the city walls. Within Baghdad, panic spread. Some advisors urged negotiation. Others insisted the Caliph, al-Mustasim, must trust in Allah and the loyalty of his troops. In the end, no clear decision came. A delegation was sent, carrying gifts and offers of tribute, but Hulagu's demands were absolute: unconditional surrender and the Caliph's presence at his feet. The Caliph hesitated too long. In January, the siege began. For weeks, great boulders crashed against the ramparts, while volleys of arrows rained down upon defenders who scarcely dared to lift their heads. At night, the Mongols lit fires along the perimeter, their silhouettes moving like shadows across the frozen fields. When the walls finally breached, the defenders broke. Some fled across the Tigris on hastily assembled rafts. Others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. None came. The Mongols entered Baghdad with methodical purpose. They moved through the city's districts in silence, pausing only to set torch to doorways and drive terrified families into the streets. Witnesses later described the slaughter in language that trembled on the edge of disbelief. Libraries burned for days, their collections of rare manuscripts curling into black ash. The great hospitals were emptied, their patients cut down where they lay. In the mosques, the cries of the dying mingled with the final prayers of the imams. The Caliph himself was taken prisoner. Hulagu received him with cold formality. To many Mongols, spilling royal blood on the earth was taboo, so al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet and trampled beneath the hooves of Mongol horses, a gesture that felt both practical and symbolic. An age had ended, and the conquerors would not pretend otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the Tigris turned dark with silt and debris. The canals that fed the city's gardens clogged with the bodies of the dead. Survivors wandered in a haze, searching for lost kin or the simplest scrap of food. And yet, amid the devastation, the Mongols set about their work of reordering. They appointed new governors, established patrols, and sent word back to Karakorum that Baghdad had fallen, as all things must eventually fall. Some chroniclers later claimed that 800,000 perished. Others counted fewer or more. The truth is impossible to know, for the memory of those days blurred quickly under the weight of grief. What endured was the sense that a chapter had closed forever. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's famous academy, was no more. The Caliphate, a line of rulers stretching back 5 centuries, had been extinguished in a single season. Yet the Mongols did not destroy without purpose. Hulagu sought to replace the old order with something more pliable, something that might yield tribute and stability. He left garrisons to watch the roads and demanded oaths of loyalty from surviving emirs. Trade was encouraged to resume, caravans allowed to pass, provided they acknowledged Mongol supremacy. In Europe, the fall of Baghdad sent ripples of dread and fascination. Envoys carried news to the courts of France and England. Tales of towers built from severed heads, of palaces sacked and emptied, of a civilization laid bare. To some Christian monarchs, the Mongols appeared as a scourge sent by God to punish the followers of Islam. Others wondered if an alliance could be struck, some impossible accord that would turn the horsemen against mutual rivals. But the Mongols cared little for the interpretations of distant kings. They measured the worth of a city by its obedience and its utility. Baghdad, for all its glories, had refused to bend, and so it was broken. In the slow months after the siege, the survivors began to rebuild in small ways. A merchant set up a stall amid blackened ruins. A scholar found an undamaged Quran and carried it to safety. In the silence after the flames, human persistence stirred again. At night, the wind moved through the empty courtyards, carrying the last traces of smoke away toward the deserts. Some said the spirit of Baghdad lingered in the dark, an echo of the songs and prayers that once filled the city. Perhaps it did. And as the Mongol armies turned their gaze toward Syria and Egypt, many must have wondered if there was any fortress left in the world strong enough to resist what was coming. But who could have imagined that out of this devastation, a new power would rise to defy the conquerors? The Mamluks rise in the shadow. In the wake of Baghdad's fall, the world of Islam seemed to hover on the edge of final collapse. With the caliphate extinguished, with cities smoking and the Silk Road choked by fear, many believed no force remained to challenge the Mongol tide. But beyond the shattered deserts of Mesopotamia, in the cities of Egypt, a different kind of strength was quietly gathering itself. Egypt had not been conquered by Mongol cavalry. Its rulers watched from a distance as each neighboring power fell in turn. They were the Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who had risen from captivity to forge their own dominion. Once bought as boys from the steppes and the Caucasus, they had trained in the arts of war until they could fight as a single, disciplined body. Their name in Arabic simply meant owned. Yet in time, they had overturned every master. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mamluks ruled Egypt in their own right, with sultans drawn from their ranks and a bureaucracy tempered by constant intrigue. They were a people shaped by hardship and ambition, and the spectacle of the Mongol conquests only deepened their resolve. As Hulagu Khan's armies moved west, the Mamluks prepared. They secured alliances with the remaining emirs of Syria, gathered intelligence from fleeing merchants, and reinforced the garrisons along the frontiers. They understood that no wall could stop the Mongols. Only mobility, discipline, and a willingness to meet the invaders in open battle could offer any hope. In 1260, the Mongol vanguard reached Damascus, which capitulated with little struggle. Envoys were dispatched to Cairo, demanding that the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz submit and send tribute. The message was simple, and by then well rehearsed: surrender or be destroyed. But Qutuz did not answer with submission. He convened his commanders in the citadel, a high fortress overlooking Cairo's rooftops and gardens. They decided that to wait was to invite the same fate as Baghdad. If the Mongols could be challenged anywhere, it would be on ground of their choosing, before their armies could grow too comfortable on new soil. In the early spring, the Mamluk host rode out across the Sinai and into Palestine. They moved quickly, passing through Gaza and pressing north toward the town of Ain Jalut. There, amid the rolling fields and scrubby hills, they would make their stand. The Mongols who faced them were led by Kitbuka, a seasoned general left behind by Hulagu to oversee the western campaigns. His forces were formidable, though diminished by the departure of the main army back east, recalled to Karakoram in anticipation of the great Khan Manki's death. Even so, the Mongol cavalry carried the same fearsome reputation that had emptied cities for decades. On the morning of September 3, 1260, the two armies met. Dust rose in pale curtains as the horsemen maneuvered for position. In the ranks of the Mamluks, men tightened the straps of their helmets and whispered short prayers. Many of them had been children when Baghdad fell. They had learned to measure a man's worth by whether he could hold his nerve when all seemed lost. The Mamluks deployed an old tactic: feigned retreat. A segment of their cavalry charged and then appeared to scatter, drawing the Mongol vanguard away from their lines. Kitbuka, confident in the tried pattern of Mongol victories, pursued. As his forces advanced into the narrowing valley, the hidden Mamluk reserves wheeled around from both flanks. Suddenly, the Mongols were caught in a vice. Arrows hissed from the ridges, and disciplined Mamluk regiments surged forward, striking at the exposed flanks. For hours, the battle shifted back and forth, the sounds of hooves and steel filling the hollow places between the hills. In the final moments, Kitbuka was captured. He refused to bow to the Sultan, reportedly declaring that he feared no man, only God. His execution followed swiftly, a final statement that the Mongol tide could be checked after all. The victory at Ain Jalut echoed far beyond the battlefield. It marked the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in open combat. Word spread through the mosques and markets of the Islamic world that the conquerors were not invincible. In Cairo, the people poured into the streets to celebrate, their relief mingled with wonder. Yet the Mamluks did not allow themselves complacency. They knew that Hulagu's armies still loomed to the east and that defeat could return as swiftly as victory had come. They strengthened their fortifications, reorganized their levies, and secured treaties with neighboring cities. In time, their control of Syria became firm, and the Mongols were forced to accept that the western limits of their empire had been drawn in Egyptian sand. For the Mamluk sultans, Ain Jalut became the cornerstone of their legitimacy. It proved that destiny could be remade, that even in an age of catastrophe, disciplined courage could alter the course of history. Among the chroniclers of Baghdad and Damascus, the tale passed into legend, a story of a people who rose from bondage to defy the greatest empire of their age. Some saw in it the working of divine will, others simply called it the triumph of preparation over arrogance. And in the quiet hours after the battle, when the wounded were tended and the dead laid to rest, the survivors looked out across the empty fields and wondered whether this fragile victory would hold. For what force could truly contain the restlessness that still smoldered on the far side of every horizon? The shadow of the plague. Long after the horsemen of Genghis Khan had ridden west, another traveler began its slow passage along the same roads, a visitor with no banners or heralds, no demands or negotiations. It came hidden in the dark corners of cargo holds, in the warm fur of rats, in the hunger of fleas. Where the Mongols had conquered by force, this new force conquered by silence. Historians would call it the Black Death, but in the beginning it had no name, only rumors. In the trading ports of the Crimea, sailors spoke of a pestilence that had crept out of Asia, killing entire towns before disappearing again. In 1346, as Genoese merchants loaded their ships in the harbor of Kaffa, they noticed that the Mongol army encamped beyond the walls seemed strangely diminished. Some said a sickness had spread through the ranks. Some said it had been sent by God to punish the invaders. Whatever its source, the contagion traveled westward. When the ships returned to Constantinople, their holds were full of spices, silk, and passengers whose bodies soon erupted in dark swellings. From the Byzantine capital, the plague fanned out across the Aegean and into Italy, moving in slow, unstoppable ripples. By the autumn of 1347, it had entered Messina. The city's physicians were bewildered, patients burned with fever, their flesh mottled with livid blotches. Most died within days, their final breaths shallow and rattling. Fear moved faster than any rat or flea. When the first ships docked in Venice and Marseille, officials tried to bar them from unloading, but the infection had already spread into the labyrinth of alleys and marketplaces. Soon, it reached Paris, then London, then the small towns that clung to the edges of forests and rivers. No fortress could withstand it. No walls could turn it aside. Along the Silk Road, the caravans faltered. Merchants who had once carried bolts of silk now carried death. Outposts that had thrived under Mongol protection became places of dread. Entire stations were abandoned, their wells fouled, and their stables empty. In the cities, the tolling of bells became a constant backdrop, marking each funeral procession as it wound slowly toward mass graves. Chroniclers struggled to describe what was happening. Some claimed half of humanity had perished. Others insisted the end of the world was at hand. In their confusion, they reached for old explanations, divine judgment, miasmas rising from corrupted soil, or the malevolence of strangers. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells. In many towns, pogroms followed, as terror turned to violence. Yet not all succumbed to panic. In Florence, the writer Boccaccio recorded how some households chose to shut themselves away, eating sparingly and speaking in whispers, while others plunged into reckless celebration, as if to deny the darkness gathering at their doors. Between these two extremes lay the quiet endurance of the many, mothers tending the sick, priests giving last rites, gravediggers laboring until they collapsed beside the bodies they buried. In the lands once ruled by the Mongols, the plague struck with the same indifference. Samarkand, Baghdad, and Tabriz all suffered. The trade routes that had once made their fortunes now became corridors of infection. Some Mongol khanates fragmented under the strain. Others hardened their control, imposing brutal quarantines and punishing those who tried to flee. But the plague was beyond any earthly power to contain. It traveled in the breath of the dying and the restless feet of the living. In Europe, the social order began to shift under the weight of so many funerals. With laborers scarce, peasants demanded higher wages. Serfs left their lords' estates in search of better terms. Old certainties about God's favor and the natural order began to crumble. The Black Death did not merely empty villages, it loosened the bonds that had held medieval society together for generations. Amid the horror, there were glimpses of a different future. Some survivors turned to new ideas, questioning the authority of the Church and the justice of a world where so many innocents died. Others found a hard, enduring faith in the face of loss, and in the silence that followed each wave of infection, families gathered in smaller, altered communities, piecing together what remained of their lives. Along the deserted roads, where the caravans once passed in steady processions, the milestones still stood. They marked distances no traveler dared attempt while the plague raged. And when the last of the disease had receded, when the rats had vanished as suddenly as they came, the roads waited for the cautious return of trade and hope. In the centuries to come, chroniclers would look back on this calamity as the hinge of an age. They would say, the Black Death ended the medieval world as surely as any conquest, that it reminded humanity of its fragility in ways no empire ever could. And perhaps, in the quietest moments, those who survived wondered whether the Mongols had been the prelude, and this sickness the true conqueror, a silent claimant to the throne of history. Yet even then, in the shadow of so much loss, the human spirit began to stir again. Who could have foreseen that out of this darkness, a different vision of the world would slowly emerge? The quiet strength of the monasteries. While plague and war swept across the towns and fields, there remained islands of stillness, places where the rhythms of life did not break entirely, even as the world beyond their walls convulsed. These were the monasteries. From the snowy cloisters of northern Europe to the sun-baked abbeys of Italy, the monks kept their quiet discipline. They rose before dawn to chant the canonical hours, their voices weaving into a low tide of prayer that washed over stone walls darkened by candle soot. For centuries, monasteries had been more than houses of devotion. They were storehouses of learning, where the wisdom of ancient texts waited in careful lines of ink. In scriptoria, patient hands copied Aristotle and Augustine onto fresh vellum. The scratching of quills was a soft counterpoint to the louder stories of battle and ambition unfolding beyond the gates. During the Black Death, the monasteries were not spared. Entire communities sickened and vanished in a matter of weeks. Monks buried their brothers with solemn ritual, then returned to the chapel to sing the same psalms, even as the choir thinned. Yet the discipline of their days did not falter. In the face of terror, the rule of Saint Benedict remained a framework to hold their purpose together. In these cloisters, healing also took place. Monastic infirmaries, though primitive by modern standards, were often the only refuge for the sick and destitute. Herbal remedies distilled from sage and lavender, compresses of vinegar and rosewater, small gestures of care, offered in a world that seemed to have lost its balance. For many, the monastery represented a threshold between this life and the next. Pilgrims came seeking absolution or a quiet place to die. The monks did what they could, offering prayers and simple comforts. In the end, they too were only men. But in their discipline and constancy, there was a gentleness that soothed the fear that no power remained capable of compassion. Beyond tending the sick, the monasteries also became shelters for knowledge. When cities burned or emptied, refugees sometimes brought books and scrolls, small treasures rescued from the chaos. Monastic libraries grew heavier with these salvaged fragments, preserving what might have otherwise been lost to fire or neglect. The monks copied not only scripture, but medicine, law, and philosophy. In these pages, a vision of a more ordered world remained intact, ready to be rediscovered when the storms had passed. Meanwhile, in the gardens bounded by cloister walks, life pressed on with quiet insistence. Rows of cabbages and leeks fed the community. Bees hummed among the herbs. The seasons turned. Even in the worst years of pestilence, seedlings were coaxed into growth, as if to remind the monks that renewal always began in small, patient acts. Some chronicles record that when the plague began to ebb, the first markets to reopen were those near monasteries. There, merchants returned cautiously to trade, emboldened by the calm presence of the brothers who had never fled. The monasteries became the first points of stability in a Europe that struggled to remember what normal life felt like. Over time, the monasteries' role deepened. They offered education to orphaned children. They stored surplus grain against famine. They kept records that would later help rebuild economies and settle land disputes. In an age when most felt powerless, these quiet institutions became proof that continuity was possible. Their influence was not always benign. Monasteries owned vast estates and commanded wealth. They could be as worldly as the secular lords, whose power they sometimes criticized. But in those years of fear and disintegration, the sight of a cloistered community still singing at vespers was an anchor. Even those who did not share the monks' faith found comfort in their steadiness. Travelers arriving at a monastery gate after days on the plague-ravaged road were given bread and a place to sleep. The bells that called the monks to prayer marked time for the villages nearby, as if to say that life had not entirely unraveled. In the evenings, the brothers gathered in the chapter house to read aloud. They recited chronicles of past calamities and deliverance, memories of wars and plagues that had come before and eventually passed. It was a form of collective remembering, a way to affirm that nothing was truly unprecedented, that suffering had always been woven into the fabric of the world, but so too had the slow work of renewal. When the final wave of the plague subsided, the monasteries emerged thinner and poorer, but intact. Their gardens still yielded herbs. Their libraries remained whole. Their bells rang out across fields that had grown quiet, but would soon stir again with planting and harvest. In the hush that followed the devastation, those bells were perhaps the clearest signal that Europe was ready to begin again. And in the simplicity of that sound, soft metal striking the air, lay a reminder that endurance often takes the quietest form. Could it be that the greatest power is not in conquest or wealth, but in the quiet work that continues even when the world seems lost? The dream of Mongol Europe. Long before the plague ships crossed the Mediterranean, Another current of possibility had stirred the imagination of Europe, a dream as vast as it was unlikely. It began in the years when the Mongol conquests seemed unstoppable. As their armies thundered west through Persia and the Caucasus, word reached Europe that a new power had risen, one whose reach surpassed any kingdom known. From the courts of Hungary to the papal chambers in Rome, rumors spread of a force so formidable that it might one day sweep all Christendom into its grasp. And yet, alongside fear, a strange fascination took root. For many European monarchs and churchmen, the Mongols were more than conquerors. They were a puzzle. Reports describe them as pagans who honored no Christian god, but also as potential allies against the Muslim powers that had long challenged Europe from the south and east. In these uncertain impressions, a vision flickered, a grand alliance. If only the Mongols could be persuaded to turn their strength against shared enemies, perhaps Jerusalem itself could be reclaimed. Perhaps the map of the known world could be redrawn under banners that mingled the cross with the horsehead standard. So envoys were dispatched. Letters written in careful Latin and translated into Persian and Mongolian traveled by hand across thousands of miles. Friars and merchants carried them through the Black Sea ports and across the steppes. In return, Mongol couriers brought messages sealed with the imprint of the Great Khan, a token of recognition, though rarely of submission. One such mission was led by Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a Franciscan friar who left Lyon in 1245 and reached the Mongol camp near Karakorum nearly a year later. The journey was an ordeal of bitter cold and endless distance. Along the way, he recorded everything: the customs of the Mongol nobility, the size of their armies, the discipline that held their conquests together. He found little willingness to negotiate as equals. The Mongol court expected tribute, not treaties. Yet they received him courteously enough, a reminder that their ambitions were as much about spectacle as simple conquest. When Carpine returned to Europe, he carried letters that made no promises. The Mongol Great Khan demanded submission, not alliance. Still, the dream of a partnership persisted. Other emissaries followed: Dominican monks, Venetian traders, curious diplomats, each hoping to discover some hidden sympathy that might be turned to Europe's advantage. Meanwhile, in Paris and Rome, maps were redrawn to show the vastness of Mongol dominion. Chronicles began to weave tales of a half-mythic empire whose rulers commanded men by the million and could send cavalry across entire continents. Some believed that Genghis Khan himself had been a scourge sent by God to punish sin. Others whispered of Prester John, a fabled Christian king said to dwell somewhere in Asia, perhaps even in league with these fierce horsemen. Amid these speculations, a peculiar ambivalence grew. The Mongols were both the terror at Europe's gates and a mirror reflecting Europe's own hunger for empire. They were feared for their ferocity, yet admired for their discipline. To some, they seemed the embodiment of all that civilization might become if stripped of sentiment and devoted entirely to conquest. In time, these hopes and anxieties settled into a quieter curiosity. As the Mongol domains fractured into smaller khanates, their capacity to threaten Western Europe waned. But the embassies did not cease entirely. Venetian merchants, especially, maintained tenuous ties, trading silk and spices through the Black Sea ports that survived the plagues and wars. It was a period when the outlines of the world grew less fixed. A Florentine banker might fund an expedition to Cathay, believing that fortune waited beyond the Caspian Sea. A French friar might journey to a Mongol court and return convinced that faith could spread anywhere if carried by enough conviction. The Silk Road, already ancient, became more than a trail of caravans. It was an artery along which the dreams of empires and religions mingled. In that mingling lay the seeds of modernity, the idea that no culture existed in isolation, that knowledge and trade moved across all frontiers, even those defined by fear. By the early 14th century, the reality of a Mongol Europe had receded. The Mongol armies turned east again to settle their own rivalries. The unity Genghis Khan had forged began to fracture under the ambitions of his descendants. Yet the memory of those decades lingered, a time when Europe looked east and saw not only threat, but possibility. when maps seemed to expand with every passing year, and no one could be certain where the limits of power or faith might lie. In the quiet hours of winter evenings, when scribes copied the letters of old embassies by candlelight, they preserved a record of this brief, improbable connection. And perhaps, as they worked, they felt a flicker of wonder, that for a moment the world had seemed vast enough to hold every ambition. Could it be that the true legacy of the Mongols was not their conquests alone, but the idea that no boundary was ever truly secure? The unraveling of an empire. In the beginning, it had seemed that the Mongol Empire would last forever. From the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Hungary, it stretched like a single vast skin across the earth. Couriers galloped between capitals in an unbroken chain, bearing decrees stamped with the Great Seal. Taxes flowed in from 100 peoples, their languages and customs as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. It was an empire unlike any the world had seen, built not on the slow accumulation of centuries, but on the sudden violence of a single lifetime. In less than 80 years, the Mongols had redrawn the map of Eurasia. And yet, even as the empire reached its greatest extent, the forces of its dissolution were gathering. It began, as it often does, with the question of succession. Genghis Khan had set the pattern, a supreme ruler whose sons and grandsons were granted domains to govern in his name. When he died in 1227, his empire was divided into 4 great khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. For a time, this division proved practical. Each branch of the family pursued its ambitions while maintaining a nominal loyalty to the great Khan in Karakoram. But blood ties frayed quickly under the weight of distance and rivalry. As new generations came to power, the unity that had terrified the world began to fracture. Each Khanate developed its own interests, its own quarrels with neighbors, and its own style of rule. In Persia, the Ilkhans grew accustomed to Persian advisors and Persian wealth. They adopted the trappings of Islamic kingship, even converting to Islam in the late 13th century. Their armies fought not only to expand the empire, but to defend it from fellow Mongols to the east and Mamluks to the west. In Russia, the Golden Horde maintained tribute over the fragmented principalities along the Volga. Yet their grasp was never absolute. Over generations, the Russian princes learned to maneuver between submission and rebellion, biding their time until the Horde's strength waned. In China, the Yuan dynasty achieved heights of opulence that would have astonished the nomads of Genghis Khan's generation. Kublai Khan built a capital at Dadu, what we know today as Beijing, where Persian astronomers advised Chinese ministers, and merchants from Venice stood in the palace audience halls. But with grandeur came complacency. The Yuan court became a labyrinth of intrigue. Famine and flooding strained the treasury, and resentment simmered among the Chinese population, who never fully accepted Mongol rule. As the 14th century advanced, the symptoms of decline grew obvious. The plague swept along the trade routes that had once been the empire's pride. In some regions, entire tax districts vanished, depopulated by sickness or flight. In others, ambitious generals turned their armies against fellow Mongols rather than foreign enemies. The bonds of kinship could not hold back the logic of ambition. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate fragmented into smaller domains. Rival claimants struck alliances with Turks, Persians, and even European merchants, each promising favor in return for loyalty. In Persia, the last Ilkhan died without an heir in 1335. The throne became a prize contested by warlords and tribal leaders, none strong enough to reunite the realm. And in China, the Yuan faced a tide of rebellions. The Red Turban movement rose among the peasantry, driven by hunger and a longing for native rule. In 1368, Zhu Yunzhang, a former Buddhist monk, marched into Dadu. The last Yuan emperor fled north, leaving the Ming dynasty to claim the mandate of heaven. In less than a century and a half, the empire that had once joined Europe and Asia dissolved into its component parts. Yet the Mongols' passing left behind more than ruins. The memory of their roads and relays endured. Trade revived in fits and starts, carried by those who remembered how silk and silver once flowed unimpeded across the steppes. Languages blended: Arabic, Persian, Mongolian, Chinese. Words slipped across frontiers and into the vocabularies of merchants and scribes. In the centuries that followed, travelers would look east and still speak of the Mongol era as a time when all horizons had briefly drawn together, a time when no power seemed beyond reach, and the world had shrunk to fit within a single vision of conquest. And when the chroniclers of Europe wrote their histories, they noted with a peculiar awe how quickly the Mongol flame had flared and faded. They wondered whether any empire could ever again span so much and hold so little permanence. As dawn broke over the steppe, the old caravan routes remained, empty perhaps, but waiting. What force, they must have wondered, would be the next to stir along those endless roads? The legacy that lingered. When the Mongol Empire finally collapsed into a quilt of rival khanates, the rest of the world exhaled in relief. From the fortified cities of Eastern Europe to the mountain fortresses of Persia, rulers who had once paid tribute or trembled behind their walls began to reclaim their independence. But the end of Mongol supremacy did not erase what they had shaped. The conquest had left marks not only on maps, but in the deeper tissues of culture, trade, and memory. Marks that would echo long after the last Mongol banners had been lowered. On the Silk Road, the flow of caravans never fully ceased. Though the great relay stations grew quieter, and the once regimented patrols that guaranteed safety faded, merchants still pressed on through the high passes and desert tracks. They carried with them more than goods. They carried stories. In Genoa and Venice, traders told of vast cities in China lit by lanterns, of Persian gardens in Samarkand, of roads so straight and smooth that a man could ride for days without turning. In the ports of the Black Sea, dock workers spoke of steppe nomads who could loose arrows from horseback with unerring aim, and of markets where languages mingled in a single, vibrant chorus. These memories became part of Europe's own imagination, a picture of Asia as a place at once terrifying and alluring, a place of silk and spices, but also of empires that could rise and fall with bewildering speed. The Mongols had also left subtler inheritances. Their Khans, for all their ruthlessness, valued skill over birth. In their courts, Chinese engineers designed siege weapons for Persian campaigns, and Venetian craftsmen minted coins for Central Asian markets. That mingling of expertise showed how knowledge could travel faster than any army. Even the plague, so often blamed on Mongol expansion, had paradoxically linked the continents more tightly. As devastation receded, survivors found themselves more aware of distant peoples. The shared trauma of the Black Death became a grim thread connecting villages from England to Syria. In Russia, the centuries of Mongol tribute left a deep impression. The princes of Muscovy learned the art of centralized rule in the shadow of the Golden Horde. The taxes they once carried east would, in time, fund their own ambitions. And when Ivan III finally cast off Mongol suzerainty, he borrowed their methods to build a Russian autocracy. In China, the Yuan dynasty's defeat by the Ming did not wholly erase Mongol influence. Administrative practices, census systems, and certain ideas about imperial authority survived, woven quietly into the institutions that followed. Across the Islamic world, memories of Hulagu's conquest remained vivid. The fall of Baghdad haunted scholars and poets, a cautionary tale about the cost of division and the impermanence of greatness. And yet, even in that devastation, there were glimmers of resilience, like the libraries that survived in Cairo, or the merchants who rebuilt trade networks along the Persian Gulf. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The Mongol Empire had proven that the known world could be bound together in a single system, however briefly. No kingdom or caliphate could assume its borders were sacred. No wall was high enough to guarantee safety. In this way, the Mongols had prepared the ground for later transformations. The European age of exploration, when caravels set out across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, grew partly from this conviction that the world was a single, discoverable whole. When Marco Polo finally wrote of his journeys, his readers were captivated less by the novelty of China than by the sense that it could be reached, that the roads were real, the cities tangible, and the wonders not simply legends. Time moved on. The Khanates shrank or were absorbed by rising powers. The Ottomans in Anatolia, the Safavids in Persia, the Ming in China, the Muscovites in Russia. But the roads remained, worn, repaired, forgotten, and rediscovered in turn. At dawn, in the quiet intervals between caravans, the desert tracks must have looked unchanged. Pale ribbons across the earth, waiting for footsteps to renew them. And perhaps that is the truest testament to the Mongol era, that it revealed how the fates of empires, merchants, and pilgrims were woven together by forces no single ruler could ever fully control. The last chroniclers of that age wrote with a kind of tired reverence. They knew they were recording not only the deeds of conquerors, but the first drafts of a more connected world. A world where ideas and diseases, silks and faiths, traveled farther and faster than ever before. And so, as the final Mongol horsemen faded into legend, they left behind an inheritance more enduring than any palace or victory. They had reminded humanity that no frontier was truly absolute, that the horizon was always a little wider than it first appeared, and that the quiet threads binding distant peoples could prove, in time, to be stronger than any sword.